In the Dnipropetrovsk region of eastern Ukraine, a Ukrainian assault regiment has just pulled off one of the deepest single advances either side has managed in months, and the story of how it happened, why it happened, where it did, and what it means for the wider war is worth walking through slowly because the headline numbers only tell part of it. On July 13th, fighters from the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, known by its call sign Skala, or Skalia, meaning rock, announced that they had liberated 6 villages in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The settlements are Turnov, Zaporizhzhia, Novahorivka, Voronezh, Sichneva, and Malivka. According to the unit itself, the depth of the advance was 25 kilometers. That is an extraordinary figure for this stage of the war. For most of the past 2 years, frontline movement in Ukraine has been measured in hundreds of meters, sometimes a kilometer or two after weeks of grinding assaults. A 25-kilometer breakthrough, confirmed independently across multiple Ukrainian outlets, including Ukrinform, Ukrainska Pravda, and the specialist military outlet Militarny, represents a genuine rupture in the Russian defensive line, not just a local tactical gain. The regiment says the operation liberated more than 120 square kilometers of territory. Military analysts tracking the front, including the open-source mapping project Deep State, along with Militarny, put the figure slightly higher at around 126 square kilometers. The gap between those two numbers is not really a contradiction. It is the normal fog that surrounds any fast-moving operation. Self-reported figures from the unit that carried out the assault tend to come out first, and they tend to be conservative, because a unit does not want to overstate what it has done when the ground still needs to be cleared, mines still need to be found, and Russian units in the rear still need to be pushed out before anyone can call a village fully secured. Independent trackers, once they have had a chance to review satellite imagery, geolocated footage, and unit reporting from multiple brigades, sometimes arrive at a marginally larger number. Either way, both figures describe the same basic reality: a large chunk of previously occupied land changing hands in a short window of time. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand where Dnipropetrovsk region sits in the broader shape of the war. For most of the full-scale invasion, Dnipropetrovsk was not considered a frontline region at all. It sits west of Donetsk region and north of Zaporizhzhia region, and for years the fighting stayed on the other side of the administrative border. That changed as Russian forces, pushing hard along the Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka axes in Donetsk region, began to spill across into Dnipropetrovsk territory. Small footholds turned into contested villages, and by the second half of last year, Ukrainian officials were acknowledging that Russian units had established a presence, however limited, inside Dnipropetrovsk region itself. That was a significant psychological and political moment in Ukraine, because it meant the war had, for the first time in a long while, expanded into a region that had not previously seen Russian boots on the ground during this phase of the conflict. So, when a Ukrainian regiment announces it has pushed the Russians back out of 6 villages and driven the line 25 kilometers deep, it is not simply a matter of one axis moving forward. It is a partial reversal of one of the more unsettling trend lines of the war: the slow creep of Russian control into a new administrative region. That context is part of why this operation has drawn so much attention inside Ukraine, even if it has not, as the regiment itself pointed out, made the same kind of splash internationally that some other developments have. Now to the mechanics of how it happened, because the tactical details tell you something important about how Ukraine is fighting this stage of the war. According to the regiment's own statement, dozens of assault groups began moving simultaneously from the area of Velika Mikhailivka, pushing out in both easterly and southerly directions at the same time. That detail, moving on 2 axes at once from a single staging area, is a deliberate way of forcing a defender to split attention and reserves. If Russian commanders in the sector had concentrated everything on blocking an eastern push, the southern axis would have been left exposed, and vice versa. By attacking in both directions simultaneously, with many small groups rather than a handful of large ones, the regiment appears to have been trying to create multiple crises for the defenders at once, so that no single countermove could contain the whole situation. The regiment also says the assault was conducted with constant air support, and that enemy positions along the routes of advance were struck around the clock. That is consistent with what has become the dominant pattern of this war over the past 2 years. Ground assaults are rarely attempted anymore without a layered screen of reconnaissance and strike drones working continuously overhead, day and night, to spot movement, call in fire, and prevent the defenders from repositioning or reinforcing unseen. One detail from the regiment's statement stands out in particular. They say they systematically work to identify and eliminate enemy drone pilots. This is a recognition of how central drone operators have become to modern battlefield survival and lethality. A well-positioned enemy drone team can stall an assault as effectively as an artillery battery, sometimes more so, because a single first-person view drone with an explosive payload can destroy an armored vehicle or kill an infantry squad with far less cost and far less warning than a traditional strike. Targeting the operators themselves, rather than only the drones they fly, reflects a maturing understanding on the Ukrainian side of where the real leverage sits in this kind of fighting. Take out the pilot, and you do not just lose one drone, you degrade the unit's ability to see and strike for as long as it takes to train or move in a replacement. On the question of who was on the other side of this fight, the operation is reported to have inflicted what the regiment calls critical losses on Russia's 120th Marine, or Naval Infantry Division, along with units belonging to the 68th Army Corps. These are the formations that had been holding this section of the line. A division taking what a friendly source describes as critical losses should always be read with a degree of caution, because loss assessments made by the side that just won an engagement are understandably going to lean toward the more favorable interpretation. That said, the underlying claim that a formation absorbed serious damage while trying to hold a position that then collapsed across a 25-kilometer front is broadly consistent with how these things tend to play out. Defensive lines rarely just evaporate. They break because the units holding them have been worn down past the point where they can respond to a coordinated multi-axis push, and that wearing down shows up afterward as exactly the kind of casualty and equipment loss picture the regiment is describing. There is also a specific and, from an analytical standpoint, quite interesting detail buried in the regiment's account involving the settlement of Dnipropetrovsk. The regiment says it destroyed personnel assembly areas belonging to Russia's 656th Motorized Rifle Regiment there and describes Dnipropetrovsk as sitting on a vital logistics route for the enemy. Gaining control of that settlement, or at least bringing it under fire control, did two things at once. First, it disrupted the flow of supplies and reinforcements moving through that corridor, which is exactly the kind of choke point interdiction that has defined so much of the past year of this war. Everyone from strategic planners down to individual drone crews looking for the roads, rail lines, and depots that let a modern military function, and then cutting them. Second, and this is the detail worth pausing on, the regiment says the advance let them extend the operational range of their own strike drones. Every kilometer a front line moves forward is a kilometer that friendly strike and reconnaissance drones do not have to fly just to reach the edge of contested territory, which means they arrive with more fuel or battery reserve, can loiter longer over target areas, and can reach further into what was previously safe Russian rear territory. In a war where drone range and endurance have become one of the single most important tactical currencies on both sides, pushing the front line forward is not just about taking ground for its own sake, it is about buying reach for every strike asset that follows behind the infantry. Put those pieces together, the multi-axis assault groups, the round-the-clock air cover, the deliberate hunting of drone operators, the disruption of a logistics node at Dnipropetrovsk, and the resulting extension of drone range, and what emerges is a picture of a fairly sophisticated combined arms operation, not a lucky breakthrough. That is worth emphasizing because it says something about how Ukrainian assault regiments, several years into this war, have refined their approach. The early years of the full-scale invasion saw plenty of costly, less coordinated assaults. What is being described here, dozens of groups, two axes, continuous air support, targeted degradation of the enemy's sensor network before and during the push, reads much more like a unit that has internalized hard lessons about how to actually break a prepared defensive line rather than simply throw people at it. It is also worth being honest about the limits of what can be independently verified in a report like this one. The core facts, the 6 named villages, the 25-kilometer figure, the roughly 120 to 126 square kilometers of territory, and the identification of the Russian formations involved are corroborated across several separate Ukrainian outlets drawing on the same underlying military source, plus at least one open-source mapping project that tracks front-line changes independently using satellite and geolocated imagery. That is a reasonably solid evidentiary basis by the standards of real-time war reporting. What cannot be independently verified from where we sit is the precise casualty toll inflicted on the Russian side, the internal state of the units that were pushed back, or whether every meter of the newly claimed territory is fully cleared and secured versus still contested in what analysts often call a gray zone, an area where neither side has firm operational control. Wars are reported in layers. First the claim, then the corroboration, then, sometimes days or weeks later, the fuller picture as more units publish their own accounts, as prisoners are processed, and as independent trackers finish reviewing the imagery. What we have right now sits solidly in that second layer, well corroborated, but not yet the final word. Now, here is where the story gets more complicated and where a purely celebratory read of this operation would miss something important about the state of the war in this exact region. At the very same time that Ukrainian forces were pushing the line back by 25 kilometers in one part of Dnipropetrovsk region, authorities were ordering a mandatory evacuation of civilians from 2 more settlements elsewhere in that very same oblast. Alexander Hanza, who heads the Dnipropetrovsk Regional Military Administration, confirmed that mandatory evacuation has been introduced for all residents of Vasilkivka in the Sinelnikov district and Vyshchatarasivka in the Nikopol district. Children had already been evacuated from those places earlier. Now the adults are being told they must leave too. More than 6,500 people are said to still be living in those two settlements. That juxtaposition, a major offensive gain in one part of the region and a fresh mandatory evacuation order in another part of the same region, is not a contradiction. It is actually a fairly precise snapshot of what this stage of the war looks like along Ukraine's eastern and southern fronts. Dnipropetrovsk region is not a single uniform battle space. It borders both Donetsk region, where Russian forces continue to press hard around Pokrovsk and toward Novopavlivka, and it has a southern edge that runs down toward the Zaporizhzhia direction, near the Dnipro River in the city of Nikopol, which sits just across the river from Russian-occupied Enerhodar and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Different sections of that regional boundary are experiencing entirely different military realities at the same moment. In the area around Velika Mikhailivka, where the Skala regiment launched its assault, Ukrainian forces just achieved a significant local success. Meanwhile, in the Sinelnikov and Nikopol districts, further south and east, Russian pressure, whether through artillery range, drone strikes, or the general proximity of contested ground, has grown severe enough that officials have judged it necessary to clear out the remaining civilian population entirely. This is worth dwelling on because it cuts against a common instinct when reading war news, the instinct to treat any given headline as representative of the whole front. It is not. A single oblast can contain a genuine breakthrough in a worsening evacuation crisis simultaneously in different districts, sometimes only tens of kilometers apart. Understanding the war accurately means holding both of those realities in your head at once, rather than picking whichever one fits a preferred narrative. The evacuation order for Vasilkivka and Vyshchatarasivka is also not an isolated event. It is the latest step in a pattern that has been unfolding for months. Back in mid-May, Hanza announced mandatory evacuations from parts of the Nikopol district, covering Novokivka and Ilinka in the Marhanets community, plus Vyshchatarasivka in what was then described as the Myrove rural community, along with nearly 100 streets in the city of Nikopol itself. At that time, officials said just over 1,100 people needed to leave, with 34 children among them. Then, on June 17th, Dnipropetrovsk region authorities began a further mandatory evacuation, this time of families with children, from 23 additional settlements in the Sinelnikov district, spread across the Shakhtarske, Dubovikivka, and Bohinivka communities, with close to 3,800 children expected to leave over the following month. By early July, officials were confirming that evacuations from parts of both the Sinelnikove and Nikopol districts were still ongoing before the announcement covering Vasilkivka and Vyshchatarasivka brought the adult population of those two remaining settlements into the mandatory evacuation zone as well. Laid end to end, that is a rolling, months-long depopulation of the districts closest to the fighting in southern and eastern Dnipropetrovsk region, moving first through families with children, then circling back to clear out the adults left behind. It is the kind of grinding, unglamorous administrative process that rarely gets the same attention as a 25-kilometer offensive breakthrough, but it is arguably just as important for understanding the human cost and the strategic picture in this part of the country. Hanza has said that evacuees are initially received at one of 5 transit centers set up around the region, where they can access financial, legal, psychological, and medical assistance, along with food and hygiene kits. Officials have also said that if people need longer-term housing, authorities will help them find it, either in safer parts of Dnipropetrovsk region itself or in other regions of Ukraine altogether. That infrastructure, transit centers, coordinated relocation support, has had to be built and scaled up specifically because this pattern of rolling evacuation has become such a persistent feature of the war in this region. It is also worth noting, gently, that the underlying reason these evacuations continue is the same reason the offensive near Velika Mikhailivka was fought in the first place. Russian forces remain active and dangerous across large stretches of the broader Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka direction, and Dnipropetrovsk region's southern and eastern edges sit close enough to that fighting and close enough to Russian strike range that civilian life there has become untenable in the areas most exposed. Ukrainian military reporting around the same period noted that Russian forces were continuing to press hardest along the Pokrovsk direction specifically, with dozens of clashes recorded there and in the neighboring Sloviansk direction within a single day. So even as one Ukrainian regiment was rolling the line backward by 25 kilometers to the north of these evacuation zones, the broader Donetsk-facing front that feeds pressure into Dnipropetrovsk region from the east remained and remains very much active. Stepping back from the immediate district-level picture, there is a wider strategic story unfolding this month that helps explain both why an operation like the one near Velika Mikhailivka was possible and why the war as a whole may be entering a different phase, even as ground fighting continues in its familiar grinding form. Ukraine has spent the past year steadily escalating a long-range strike campaign against Russian oil refineries, and by the summer of this year, that campaign has produced what independent economic analysts and multiple news organizations are now describing as the most severe fuel crisis inside Russia in recent memory. The numbers here are worth laying out plainly because they are genuinely striking. According to an analysis by the Financial Times conducted jointly with the specialist monitoring group Roshan Consulting, Ukrainian forces carried out at least 194 strikes on Russian oil refining infrastructure in just the first half of this year, including a record 16 successful attacks in a single month May. Cumulative figures compiled by CNN put the total number of strikes on Russian oil facilities since the start of the full-scale invasion at over 300, with the pace of attacks accelerating dramatically over time, from a mere handful in the first year of the war to well over 100 strikes recorded in the most recent 12-month period alone. On July 6th, Ukrainian drones struck Russia's single largest oil refinery, the Gazprom facility at Omsk in Siberia, located roughly 2,500 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. Industry sources say the refinery, which alone had been producing something like 1 in every 8 liters of gasoline consumed in Russia, halted operations within a day of being hit. A few days earlier, drones had struck the Lukoil refinery in Nizhny Novgorod for the second time in roughly a week, and the Saratov refinery was forced offline following a July 7th strike. Analysts estimate that the strike campaign has knocked out somewhere between 20 and 25% of Russia's total oil refining capacity, translating into aggregate losses that Ukrainian military estimates place at roughly $13.5 billion over the past year, a figure that lines up closely with independent insurance industry estimates. The human and economic effects of that campaign inside Russia have become impossible to hide. By early July, a survey by the independent outlet Novaya Gazeta Europe found that some form of fuel crisis had spread to at least 78 of Russia's 83 internationally recognized regions, plus occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. 38 of those regions had imposed formal restrictions on gasoline sales. 3 regions, Penza, Irkutsk, and Zabaikalsky Krai, had gone so far as to declare a state of emergency over fuel supply, joining occupied Crimea and Sevastopol, which had already done so in late June. Reporters covering the story from inside Russia describe scenes that would have been unthinkable in Moscow just a couple of years ago. Drivers waiting in line for hours, sometimes overnight, to fill a tank, rationing limits of 20 to 30 liters per vehicle in many regions, a ban on filling jerry cans, and a government scrambling to loosen fuel quality regulations just to keep any product flowing to pumps. One woman quoted by the New York Times, living in Irkutsk, nearly 5,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, described queuing for 18 straight hours with her husband and infant child just to refuel their car. Moscow itself has not been spared, with residents describing days spent circling the city in search of a station that still had fuel. The Russian government has responded by banning exports of gasoline and jet fuel outright, and is reportedly weighing a similar ban on diesel exports. That fuel crisis is not simply an economic inconvenience playing out far from the front line. It has direct military consequences, which is precisely why it matters for a story about a ground offensive in Dnipropetrovsk region. A former Ukrainian drone operator and warfare specialist told the Kyiv Independent that what he called Ukraine's middle-range strike campaign has already forced some Russian units to cut diesel consumption by up to 20% and to relocate supply and command depots further back from the front, specifically to reduce their exposure to strikes while also coping with tighter fuel allocations. That is the exact same logic, seen from the other direction, as the significance the Skala regiment attached to gaining fire control over the logistics route running through Temerivka. Both sides in this war have arrived at the same conclusion, that modern combat power depends less on the raw number of soldiers or vehicles a side can field, and more on whether fuel, ammunition, and personnel can actually be moved to where they are needed, when they are needed. Ukraine's strategy over the past year has increasingly been to attack that movement directly, both at the tactical level, cutting a single logistics road through a single village, and at the strategic level, destroying the refineries that produce the fuel in the first place, thousands of kilometers from where any of it will eventually be burned. There's a maritime dimension to this campaign as well, which connects back even more directly to the southern edge of Dnipropetrovsk region and the occupied territory nearby. Ukraine has significantly escalated strikes on what is often called Russia's shadow fleet, the aging and often barely seaworthy tankers Moscow uses to move oil around sanctions restrictions, along with more conventional vessels supplying occupied Crimea. Ukraine's drone force commander said that 14 Russian vessels were struck in the Sea of Azov on a single evening in mid-July, part of a total of 35 vessels hit over just 4 days. Those strikes are aimed specifically at choking off the sea routes that keep occupied Crimea, and by extension, the southern Russian grouping that draws supplies through it functioning. Russia has reportedly had to halt shipping through the Kerch Strait at points in response. Given that Dnipropetrovsk region's southern edge, including Nikopol district, sits directly across the Dnipro River from Russian-occupied territory that ultimately connects into that same southern logistics network feeding toward Crimea, the maritime squeeze and the ground fighting in Dnipropetrovsk region are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same broader Ukrainian strategy of denying Russian forces the ability to move supplies freely, whether by road, by sea, or through a refinery 2,500 kilometers away. None of this means the war is close to a decisive end, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. Russia's economy is stagnating. Its central bank cut interest rates only marginally at its most recent meeting, despite pressure to do more, citing inflation, driven in part by what officials themselves described, almost euphemistically, as a temporary contraction in motor fuel production. But stagnation is not collapse, and a fuel crisis, however severe, has not stopped Russian forces from continuing to press hard along the Pokrovsk direction, the same direction whose pressure is part of why Dnipropetrovsk region's southern districts are still being evacuated even as a Ukrainian regiment pushes forward 25 kilometers further north. War economies under sustained strain do not necessarily produce quick capitulation. They can instead produce exactly the kind of grinding, uneven picture the war currently presents: real Ukrainian gains in some sectors, continued Russian pressure, and continued civilian displacement in others. And a Russian home front absorbing real pain without that pain, yet translating into a change of course from Moscow. Diplomatically, the picture is similarly unresolved. Ukraine's president has floated proposals for a full ceasefire to allow negotiations to proceed, while the Kremlin's spokesperson has continued to describe the war as an ongoing special operation that will proceed absent what he called sufficient willingness from Kiev. And Russian officials have shown no public appetite for the kind of direct leader-level meeting that would typically signal a genuine shift toward a negotiated settlement. What this moment in mid-July does represent, though, is a reasonably clear illustration of how the war is actually being fought and contested right now on two tracks simultaneously. The first track is the traditional one: infantry and armor moving across contested ground, village by village, using coordinated assault groups, drone cover, and the targeted disruption of enemy sensors and logistics nodes to force a breakthrough. The kind of operation the Skala regiment carried out near Velika Mikhailivka. The second track is quieter and slower to show results, but arguably just as consequential over time: a long-range campaign aimed not at any particular stretch of front line, but at the industrial base, thousands of kilometers behind it, the refineries, the tankers, the fuel that any offensive or defensive operation ultimately depends on. Both tracks are visible within this single story out of Dnipropetrovsk region, a battlefield gain, won partly because Ukrainian forces were able to extend their own strike drone range by seizing a logistics choke point at Temerivka, set against a fuel-starved Russian military apparatus that a former drone operator says is already being forced to husband its diesel and pull supply depots back from the front in response to exactly this kind of pressure. For the people actually living through this, of course, the strategic picture offers little comfort. More than 6,500 residents of Vasilkivka and Vyshchetarasivka are now being told to pack up and leave homes that, for some of them, their families may have lived in for generations, joining tens of thousands of others across the Sinelnikova and Nikopol districts who have already gone through the same process over the preceding months. Whatever the ultimate strategic significance of a 25-kilometer breakthrough 60 or 70 kilometers to the north, it will not change the fact that officials judge the situation in those two southern settlements dangerous enough to require everyone, adults included, to leave. That is the piece of this story that resists easy synthesis. The war can be simultaneously going reasonably well for Ukraine in a narrow tactical sense in one district, and forcing thousands of ordinary people out of their homes in another district of the exact same region on the exact same day the good news is being announced. As the fifth year of Russia's full-scale invasion continues to unfold, this is probably the most accurate way to describe where things stand, not a single unified narrative of advance or retreat, but a patchwork of simultaneous, sometimes contradictory developments. A battlefield breakthrough here, a mandatory evacuation there, a refinery fire in Siberia that ripples all the way down to a diesel shortage affecting a Russian unit's ability to hold a position in Donetsk region, which in turn shapes whether Dnipropetrovsk region's southern districts feel safe enough to keep their remaining civilian population in place. Understanding any single piece of that picture in isolation, whether it is a triumphant regimental statement about 6 liberated villages or a sober administrative notice about a mandatory evacuation order, only gets you part of the way to understanding the war as it actually is right now. The fuller picture requires holding all of those pieces together at once, The tactics on the ground, the fuel burning 2,500 kilometers away, and the 6,500 people currently packing their belongings because the place they call home has, once again, been judged too dangerous to stay. That is where things stand in Dnipropetrovsk region as of the middle of July. A genuine and well-corroborated Ukrainian battlefield success in one sector, a rolling and increasingly urgent evacuation effort in another, and behind both of them, a Russian war machine that is, by nearly every independent economic account available, running on a fuel supply under more sustained pressure than at any point since the invasion began, even as it continues to find the resources to keep pressing forward along other stretches of the same general front. Whether the momentum represented by the Skala regiment's advance can be sustained, whether the fuel crisis inside Russia deepens to the point of forcing a genuine change in Moscow's calculations, and whether the residents of Vasilkivka and Vyshchatarasivka will, someday, be able to return home, are all questions that remain open. What is not open to much doubt, based on everything corroborated across multiple independent sources this week, is that the war in this part of Ukraine is being fought right now on exactly the terms this single regional snapshot suggests. Contested village by village on the ground, and contested refinery by refinery, tanker by tanker, thousands of kilometers behind it. One final point is worth making about how to read reporting like this as it continues to develop in the days and weeks ahead. Battlefield claims from any single unit, however credible, tend to firm up or soften as more information becomes available. The 6 villages named by the Skala Regiment are consistently corroborated across independent Ukrainian outlets today, but the full picture of how securely each settlement is held, how many of the newly claimed square kilometers sit in a genuinely controlled blue zone versus a still contested gray zone, and what the final accounting of losses on both sides looks like, will likely keep shifting for some time. That is normal. It is how war reporting works. And it is not a reason to distrust the core facts that are well established, only a reason to keep watching how the picture fills in. The same is true on the fuel crisis side of this story. Month-to-month figures on refinery strikes and Russian refining capacity are still being revised as fresh satellite imagery and industry data come in, and the true scale of the disruption to Russian military logistics may not be fully understood until well after the fact. What can be said with confidence right now is that both storylines, the ground offensive in Dnipropetrovsk region and the deep strike campaign against Russian oil infrastructure, point in the same direction, toward a war in which Ukraine is increasingly able to combine local tactical breakthroughs with sustained pressure on the logistical foundations that keep the wider Russian war effort running, even as the human cost of continued Russian pressure elsewhere along the same front keeps forcing more civilians out of the towns and villages they call home.